Welcome to Lecture 1 in Survey Research and Design in Psychology. This lecture introduces the research method of survey research, and we'll go through some of the main types of research, those being experimental, quasi-experimental and non-experimental, of which surveys can be used in any one of those three types. I'll describe some of the distinguishing characteristics of survey-based research, and we'll talk about some of the goals and purposes of survey research. Then consider the pros and cons, disadvantages and advantages, and that will lead into Lecture 2, which is on the nuts and bolts of how to create a survey, how to go about sampling to gain responses to the survey, and so on. So types of research. It's useful to be able to distinguish between three main research methods used in science in general, but in particular in the social sciences and psychology. The full experimental model involving control and experimental groups, the quasi-experimental method where we use naturally occurring groups, and the non-experimental method where we don't have any group selection at all. So surveys and questionnaires, which at this stage I'm not distinguishing between, I'll use those terms interchangeably, may be applied in each of these types of research, but they're probably most commonly part of non-experimental studies, or put another way, non-experimental studies tend to rely heavily on surveys. Experimental research is characterized by random assignment. In other words, people are allocated to two or more groups or conditions by some process of random selection. In doing that, we try and control any other extraneous variables that may account for the findings. So, for example, if we're doing a study on headaches, we may have three different conditions: a control condition where people get no treatment, a drug condition where people get two Panadol when they have a headache, and a meditation condition where people are taught how to meditate for 5 minutes to deal with the headache. If we had a number of volunteers, we could randomly assign them to each of those three groups, and that would hopefully account for things like variation in gender and age and other variables which may otherwise be different between the groups and account for some of the variations in the findings. So the experimental method is powerful. It gives us some of the most definitive evidence and confident evidence about the differences according to different types of conditions, but it can be difficult to do. It can be unethical to pursue fully experimental research in some cases, and it may lack ecological validity. And by that, in order to control for the extraneous variables, we usually remove people from their natural setting and put them in controlled conditions where the only variation is the particular treatment. So to do this study purely in an experimental way, we'd need people to come into a laboratory and stay there, perhaps people who suffer from headaches, and we would then need them to be in those controlled settings to determine whether it was the drugs or the meditation or no treatment that was most effective. In quasi-experimental studies, we use naturally occurring groups. For example, if we wanted to compare the say political attitudes of fans of different football codes, soccer, AFL, rugby league, rugby union, it wouldn't make sense to do an experimental study to create fans out of people who didn't already have a fanship. It would make far more sense to go along and sample from each of the four types of football codes. So therefore we have non-random assignment. We may be able to control some extraneous variables, such as we may be concerned that socioeconomic status may differ between the fan groups, and so we could include at least measurement of that, or intentionally sample from people of different socioeconomic backgrounds from each of the football codes and use those as our sample. And finally, non-experimental studies don't have any groups or conditions. For example, the study we're doing as part of this unit involves us going out and administering surveys on campus to university students, and in this case we've just got one group that we're sampling from. If we went to another university and got a second sample, then that would make this a quasi-experimental study, because we might be comparing results between the two groups of students. So in these studies we have minimal or perhaps even no control over extraneous variables. We don't know whether we're going to get a representative sample by just walking out there and taking a convenience sample of students, and we run that risk or threat to the validity of the study. Alright, so let's have a little quiz here to see whether you can apply these three types of research to some different research scenarios. So what type of research is the following? Experimental, quasi-experimental, or non-experimental? A researcher seeks to survey community attitudes to eating non-traditional meat, such as venison or kangaroo. Now, it doesn't look to me like there's any groupings involved here. The researcher's not looking to compare meat eaters with non-meat eaters or different groups of people, either by random or by naturally occurring. So this means that they're just interested in the one group, the community group, and that makes this a non-experimental study. Quiz question 2. What type of research is the following? A researcher conducts a study in which the study habits of university students who regularly use marijuana are compared with uni students who do not regularly use marijuana. So clearly there's some comparison going on here between two groups, users and non-users, but there's no random allocation. We're using naturally occurring groups of students, and indeed it would be unethical to probably do this study and randomly allocate people to illegal drug use and not illegal drug use. But we could go out there and sample from naturally occurring groups, and that would make this a quasi-experimental study. Quiz question 3 then. What type of research is the following? A researcher randomly allocates volunteers to either a morning or evening exercise routine and measures and compares their sleep patterns. Well, the key there obviously is random allocation of volunteers to two different exercise routines, and that would make this an experimental study comparing two groups.